Welcome to this BPT class, where I'm going to briefly highlight the key areas of syllabus change for exams in 2024. So there have been a few changes for 2024, but nothing too significant. The majority is just the regular changes in allowances and rates. So for income tax and national insurance, the dividend allowance has been reduced to £1,000. So if you were calculating the income tax liability for an individual, just bear in mind that the dividend allowance has now been reduced. Also, the threshold for paying the additional rates of income tax has also been reduced. So it's now 100,000 plus double the personal allowance. So of course, we know when an individual net income goes above 100,000, then of course we think about tapering the personal allowance. And we know this is the personal allowance. Remember, you taper it. You take it away £1 for every £2 that the individual's adjusted net income exceeds 100,000. So therefore it gets fully tapered away at this amount. So once the personal allowance has been fully tapered away, then they will start paying the additional rates of tax. But things like the tax bands and the thresholds are probably something you'd look up in Hardman's in the exam. And generally speaking, it's quite rare to see very detailed computational questions in the BPT exam, but you may just need to identify if an individual is an additional rate payer, or you might be looking at calculating the income tax on a dividend when thinking about a company repurchase of shares, for example. Just bear in mind there have been some changes to these thresholds since you probably sat TC. So for share schemes, the amount for CSOP has increased. I mean, this is a small change, and again, definitely something that you'd be looking up in the exam anyway. It would be part of a question where you might be advising on the tax implications of either a grant, exercise, or sale of some shares which had been administered under a share scheme, where you could be advising on the most applicable type of share scheme. So you'd probably be looking up in the exam, the amounts which can be granted under each share scheme. So not really a huge significance change there, as that is something you probably would have looked up anyway. So as you may be aware from following the media, there was obviously a lot of change with national insurance over the last few years. So it had increased temporarily for exams in 2023, and the rates have now reverted back to their previous amounts. So for employees, 12% and 2%, and then employers 13.8%, and self-employed back to 9% and 2%. So in 2023, all these rates were 1.25% higher, which was effectively a temporary increase before the health and social care levy, which now isn't coming in, and national insurance rates have gone back to this. And actually, they're now going to be cut again next year. So a huge amount of change here with national insurance rates, but they've now reverted back to these rates. Again, it might be something that you just want to look up in the exam to be sure. But again, it's probably more important appreciating where and when they apply, like what they apply on, cash and cash equivalents, or is it on taxable benefits? But you've got all these reminders here in the employment income section, and also in the trading income section as well. But again, it's more identifying when national insurance would be applicable. It's a very small tax, that, like similar to VAT and stamp duty. The key is identifying in the exam where it would be relevant. And then if you are going to calculate the amount, you could kind of look that up. The 0% band as well for employees is now aligned with the personal allowance. But again, that's something you would look up in the exam. Something very detailed and specific like that is something I would definitely be looking up in the exam. The key for BPT is identifying where it would be relevant, and we'll be working on that a lot during the course. Basis periods have been simplified, so it's quite nice to have a simplification in the tax rules for a change. So you probably remember when you did principles of tax and TC, how complicated basis periods were allocating the profits to each tax year. This is greatly simplified now in that everything will be based on the tax year profits which arose in the tax year. However, and perhaps unfortunately for you, is that there are some transitional rules to move from the old basis to the new basis. But again, these would be some very detailed calculations. I think it's unlikely we're going to see a very detailed calculation of this in the BPT exam. And once again, something very detailed, I'll definitely be looking that up in the exam and then just kind of following this through and applying it to the numbers given in the scenario. Pensions annual allowance has increased to 60k. Again, it's not that significant of a change in terms of like the BPT exam, just because, if you were advising an individual on how much pension contributions, they could make, you'd obviously be referring to the annual allowance, and it's just that allowance has increased. So this would be the correct number to use. And similarly with SEIS, there's been a change in the limits there. So some of these have increased, probably most notably the maximum investment that an individual can put in to SEIS. But again, when we look at these types of questions, I'll be explaining how the key is to identify which venture capital scheme is most relevant to the scenario, the specific company, and then comparing that company to the limits, or advising the individual based on the amount they want to invest and the risk they want to take, or whether they've disposed of any assets, as to which one is most appropriate. This is just kind of a small technicality in terms of how much they can put in. But the key, as we will see, is always identifying which one is relevant from the scenario based on a specific facts in the scenario, like the company, whether they've got any disposals of other assets which give rise to capital gains, which could then be like deferred or exempted, whether they're selling the shares within the period or not. So that's going to be the key to the question. This is just a small technicality of the numbers that you'll be applying in that scenario. And then similarly, a change in the CGT annual exemption. Again, if you're calculating an individual's liability, I'll again obviously just use the updated annual exempt amount. Like that's, again, it's a relatively insignificant change in terms of the BPT exam. It's just, once you've gone through and calculated again, you've thought about all of the reliefs which might be available, whether they're taxable on the gain, depending on their residency and domicile, that's going to be the bulk of the question. And then if you do actually come down and they've got a taxable gain, you're just deducting off the annual exemption, and it's just a reduced amount now than it was perhaps since you sat TC and principles of tax. Probably the area of most significant change is around corporation tax rates. So this isn't strictly new for 2024, because this has been in the BPT syllabus for a few years, because this change has been upcoming. But when we're taxing a company's profits, the rate of tax is going to depend on the profits in her company. So small companies, 19%. The main rate, so larger companies, 25%. However, when you've got profits falling between these two amounts, and that's reduced by the number of group companies, profits falling between these two amounts, get marginal relief. So as I've said, this is covered in detail at TC for exams in 2024 in terms of the computational aspects of marginal relief. And like I said, it isn't strictly new to BPT because it has been in there for a few years. So very detailed calculations of marginal relief probably aren't going to be examined in BPT. Where we're more likely to see this examined in BPT is thinking about the best use of a loss, or the best use of like AIA, for example. Because you could have different group companies paying tax at different rates, or you could have a company you're looking at multiple years, which year would be the best year to use a loss, for example. So that's where we're most likely to see this in the BPT exam. So when we look at corporation tax losses and planning, we'll think about what is the best way to use like a loss, for example. So this is one of the considerations of many when we're deciding which method of loss relief should be applied. But again, obviously, it kind of makes quite sense. Obviously, offset the loss against a marginal rate where you can, because it effectively gives an amount of this, and then the main rate, and then obviously the small rate. So again, not really technically too significant in terms of a change, but this probably is the most significant change for BPT, because it's going to, in those planning questions, it's going to affect your decision making about like where to use a loss or where to use AIA, for example. So you do have to be comfortable with the technicalities of this, but you can use like the shortcut method, as we'll explain in the class, for calculating the tax liability in most cases when looking at marginal companies. But this is covered in a lot of detail in the losses and groups class, so we'll pick up on that in detail then. So there have been a few other changes for corporation tax, probably the area that's seen the most significant change really for this year. So capital allowances, there's been a lot of change with capital allowances in recent years. So essentially, super deduction was introduced to kind of boost the economy after COVID, where actually this was better than AIA, where you get 100%, because you get 130% on main pool assets. That comes to an end 31st of March 23. From that day onwards, companies can kind of expense the full amount, but it is better to claim AIA in priority because of the way it's treated as a disposal when that asset is sold off. That is very computational. That's very kind of TC focus, I think. I don't think we're going to get lots of detailed calculations of prorating the 30% for accounting period straddling this day in the BPT exam. That is very computational. That's very TC style topic and question. But just bear in mind, companies can claim AIA. That's probably what you're going to see most of. Buy some assets, remember they can claim AIA, but just appreciate these full expensing rules. And these are in the notes if you really need it. If you really do end up with an accounting period straddling that date, then of course you could claim the super deduction. And then again, a change on the rate is a significant change for the companies which are affected. But in terms of the BPT exam, the R&D rate, you just apply the correct rate. So is it an SME or is it a large company? And then once you've identified whether it's a large company or an SME, you can apply the applicable rate. But just bear in mind, this has changed for 2024. So the large rate, the tax credit has increased, and the SME additional deduction has reduced. But in the class, I'll explain in detail how the large company regime works, with the tax credit, which is then offset against the liability, and how the SME is an additional trading deduction. This isn't a like-for-like comparison here. And then we can think about planning aspects about how like an SME loss would be best used. For example, claim the repayment credit, which is also reduced, or surrender the loss to another company. So that's the most important there, rather than the small change in the rate. But just bear in mind that has changed if you're wondering why it looks different from when you did TC. And another example of a really insignificant change, a 0% ban for residential properties has increased. And when you're doing a stamp duty, if you do have to calculate the stamp duty liability, similar to like the income tax thresholds, that's definitely something I would look up there in Hardman's in the exam. I mean, very unlikely we really see residential properties in the BPT exam, just because there's no VAT on them, so they don't generally give as much, don't create as many tax implications as when we're looking at commercial properties. So generally we see a little bit less of residential properties in the exam, and even less likely you're going to have to do a detailed calculation of stamp duty. But if you do, like I said, that's obviously something you would look up in the exam. So like I said, I mean, this is all very standard. As I'm sure you're aware from kind of following the media, there's always little tweaks to rates and allowances. This happens every year. There isn't any syllabus changes which are kind of hugely significant. That's going to mean there's going to be a substantial change to the nature of BPT exam questions in 2024, but just wanted to draw these to your attention. Like I said, most of them are just the basic regular changes in allowances and rates. like I said, probably the most significant is the change for corporation tax rates. But this has been upcoming for quite a few years and is already featured in some of the earlier BPT exam questions in some of the earlier years questions, but this is kind of now like fully in force, if you like, from April 23. So therefore it is a, major consideration when thinking about how to claim reliefs and losses and which companies are best to claim them in. So it fits in really well to a corporation tax groups question, where you're then going to have to think about the best way to use a loss. And that's why we've made a question on that. One of the sample classes in the course, you can actually watch me work through a question in full when I work through these considerations of the best way to use a loss. And then obviously during the course, we've got even more questions where I explain these technical principles in more detail, and we work through lots of losses and groups questions so you can see these being applied in the exam. But yeah, don't focus too heavily on syllabus changes. The key in the BPT exam is interpret the scenario and apply these tax rules to the specific scenario, typing in short, concise points, as you'll see me do throughout the exam. Exam technique is absolutely key for BPT. These are just a few small technical changes that I wanted to make you aware of.